A forest is burning, but this is not a wildfire. This is not climate change alone. This is war. And while bombs fall and cities collapse, something else is being destroyed in silence. The earth itself. Not just buildings, not just lives, but soil, water, air, entire ecosystems. And the shocking part is, we measure the human cost of war in deaths, but almost never the environmental cost in carbon, in toxins, and ecological collapse. What you're about to see is not widely discussed because it changes how you understand war itself. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, that is UNEP, armed conflict is now one of the most destructive forces to ecosystems globally. But unlike hurricanes or wildfires, war damage is intentional, is prolonged, and often irreversible. War doesn't just destroy nature accidentally, it transforms nature into a weapon, a fuel source, and a casualty simultaneously. Forests become grounds, oil becomes a target, rivers become contamination pathways, and air becomes a carrier of toxic particles. But the story begins decades ago in one of the most infamous wars in modern history. During the Vietnam War, the US military sprayed an estimated 19 million gallons, that's about 72 million liters of herbicide, across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The most infamous was Agent Orange. Its purpose was simple: destroy forest cover. But the consequences were not. According to scientific studies and Vietnamese health assessments, over 3 million people were affected by the exposure. Millions of hectares of forest were defoliated. Biodiversity collapse followed in multiple regions. Dioxin contamination still persists in soil decades later. Some ecosystems still have not recovered after 50 years. And this is the first major truth about war and the environment. War damage does not end when the war ends. It lingers in soil, in water, and in genetics. But Vietnam War was only the beginning. Fast forward to 1991. During the Gulf War, retreating forces set fire to Kuwaiti oil wells. Over 600 oil wells burned. The result was one of the largest human-made environmental disasters in history. Estimates suggest that up to 6 million barrels of oil burned per day at peak. Massive CO2 and soot emissions released into the atmosphere. Toxic smoke clouds covering regions for months. The skies turned black. Day looked like night. And particles from the fires traveled across the region. The environmental cost wasn't just local, it entered the global atmosphere. But here is what most people didn't realize, that the military emissions are rarely included in global climate accountability reports. And even today, global militaries are estimated by independent researchers like the Conflict and Environment Observatory and Academic Studies to contribute roughly 5 to 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions when supply chains and operations are included. But that makes militaries comparable to entire industrial sectors, yet they are often underreported in climate agreements. But this is what people don't realize. Military emissions are rarely included in global climate accountability reports. Even today, global militaries are estimated by independent research like the Conflict Environment Observatory and Academic Studies to contribute roughly 5 to 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions when supply chains and operations are included. That makes militaries comparable to entire industrial sectors, and yet they are not often reported or underreported in many climate agreements. And now, let's consider modern warfare. In Ukraine, war has not only destroyed cities, it has also created a massive hidden climate impact. According to estimates published by the Initiative on Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War, the first year of conflict generated over 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. That is roughly equivalent to the annual emissions of a mid-sized industrial country. Where does this come from? Burning fuel for tanks, jets, and logistics, destruction of infrastructure, fires in forest and industrial sites, reconstruction demands. Cement and steel are known to be highly carbon intensive, and reconstruction itself is often overlooked because rebuilding cities requires cement, one of the highest CO2 emitting materials globally, steel, heavy transport, and so paradoxically, war continues to emit carbon even after the fighting stops, and the circle is repeating across multiple conflicts worldwide. Beyond individual wars, there is a much larger hidden system: global military infrastructure. Military bases consume massive energy: aviation fuel, naval operations, global logistic networks, and weapon manufacturing. Yet, under the Kyoto Protocol and many climate frameworks, military emissions reporting has historically been optional or incomplete, especially for international operations. This creates a blind spot in global climate accounting. Researchers estimate that if global militaries were a country, they will be among the top greenhouse gas emitters in the world. But because it is distributed across nations, it remains fragmented and underreported or underdiscussed. And this leads to a difficult question. If war accelerates climate change and climate change increases instability, then are we trapped in a feedback loop? Because the environmental damage of war is not just historical, it's accelerating, and it is reshaping the future of the planet itself. When a war ends, we usually think that the damage stops, but in reality, some of the worst environmental effects begin after the fighting ends. Across former war zones, from Vietnam to Iraq to parts of Balkans and Africa, there is a silent legacy: contaminated soil, poisoned groundwater, unexploded ordnance, and destroyed ecosystems that don't regenerate naturally. The United Nations Environment Programme (UNEP) has repeatedly warned that environmental damage in conflict zones can last decades or even centuries, especially when toxic materials enter groundwater systems. In Iraq, for example, oil infrastructure damage and industrial destruction have led to a long-term contamination in some regions. In Vietnam, dioxins from herbicides like Agent Orange are still detected in hotspots across the country more than 40 years later. This is not just pollution, this is a delayed ecological collapse. Moreover, water systems are among the first and the most fragile victims of war. Why? Because they are easily contaminated, they are structurally dependent on infrastructure, and so they are very slow to recover. When pipelines, sewage systems, or treatment plants are destroyed, water becomes unsafe almost immediately. According to global health research from WHO, contaminated water after conflict contributes to disease outbreaks, displacement increases waterborne infections, and recovery of safe water systems can take years. But there is a deeper issue. Groundwater contamination is often invisible. Once pollutants enter aquifers, they can remain for decades, spreading slowly beneath the surface. This means war doesn't just reshape land, it reshapes what future generations will drink. War zones often become unintended laboratories for ecological collapse, but the damage is not always immediate extinction. Instead, it is gradual: habitat fragmentation, migration disruption, loss of apex predators, invasive species expansion. For example, in heavily bombed or militarized zones, wildlife often disappears not just from direct harm, but from the noise, the pollution, and the habitat destruction. Landmines alone render vast areas unusable after agriculture and wildlife movement. The result is what ecologists sometimes call silent zone, landscapes that technically exist but no longer function ecologically. Here is where the crisis becomes even more dangerous. War contributes to climate change, but the climate change also increases the likelihood of conflict. This is called feedback loop. Drought increases resource competition, food insecurity increases instability, migration pressures rise, political tensions escalate, and then the conflict begins. A study published by Nature Climate Change has shown links between temperature anomalies and increased conflict risks in certain regions, especially where governance is weak. So the system becomes self-reinforcing: instability, war, emissions, then climate stress, then more instability. But this raises the question: so who pays the cost? One of the most difficult questions in environmental conflict science is accountability. who pays for the environmental recovery after war? Often, the answer is local populations, future generations, and ecosystems that cannot recover without intervention. What can actually be done? Despite the scale of the problem, solutions exist, but they require political will and global coordination. Environmental war accountability frameworks are needed. Organizations like UNEP and academic groups propose making environmental damage a formal part of war crime assessment. We also need military emissions transparency, full reporting on military carbon emissions in climate agreements, and also post-conflict ecological restoration must be added to these frameworks. This includes restoration, soil decontamination, water system rebuilding, and biodiversity recovery programs. And again, landmine removal programs is also needed. Thousands of square kilometers globally remain unusable due to unexploded ordnance. Clearing them restores both human safety and ecosystems. We also need clean reconstruction policies, rebuilding cities using lower carbon materials like recycled steel, low carbon cement alternatives, renewable powered infrastructure rebuilding. Finally, war is usually measured in borders changed and lives lost, but its environmental footprint tells a deeper story. It is written in burned forests, poisoned rivers, invisible carbon in the atmosphere, and ecosystems that may not fully return to its normal. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the earth does not distinguish between peace and war. It only responds to damage. And right now, it is responding to more than we can easily see, because long after the smoke disappears, the environment is still paying the price.